Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you to the Asia Global Institute and the University of Hong Kong for inviting me here. I feel very privileged to have a chance to share some of the work we've been doing at MIT with this audience. I should say I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A. Victor and I will be talking about maybe some of the issues that were mentioned in the introduction about artificial intelligence and the automation of work and the grand challenges for society. What I'd like to talk about first, though, is this topic here about new measures of the digital economy. It's really, I think, one of the great ironies of the digital age, one of the great ironies of the information age, is that, as you know, we have more data than ever before. Terabytes, petabytes of information. The amount of digital information has exploded hundreds of fold since just the past couple of decades. Yet, paradoxically, in many ways we have less information and less of an understanding of the real sources of value in the economy. And that's because our basic metrics of the economy, GDP and productivity and others that are based on those, were designed for a pre-information age economy. They were designed for an industrial economy. They were invented in the early 20th century. And as I'll show you, they actually do not measure the things that are creating such vibrancy. When I visited Shenzhen yesterday, or Guangzhou, or many other places, not just in China, but of course around the world, we have an explosion of innovation, an explosion of digitization, vast improvements in quality, especially these mobile phones that we all carry around with us. And this innovation, as I'll show you, is not captured in our GDP statistics. This is very important because you can't manage what you don't measure. And if we're not measuring it correctly, we're going to be making the wrong decisions, we're going to be pointing in the wrong directions. Fortunately, just as the digital economy creates these new challenges for measurement, they also have the seeds of a solution. And I'll show you a new way of measuring the digital economy based on some long-standing economic principles that haven't been implemented before. And once we implement these new approaches, I think we can get a much better understanding of the value of the digital economy. So this is work that I've been doing with some of my colleagues at MIT, Avi Gananameni and others, Felix Eggers, that is coming out in a series of papers over this coming year. But it's basically not yet published, but I want to give you guys some of the first views of what we're doing. So let me start with that basic question, how are we doing? That's the most basic question you might ask. Are we doing well or are we not doing so well? And the normal way of answering that is you look at something like GDP. When people say where the economy is growing, fast or slow, whatever, almost always, whether in China or the United States, they have in mind GDP. That is their measure of the economy. In addition, it is productivity that people define when they look at living standards. And productivity is defined as GDP divided by hours worked, or sometimes also including capital. So if you get GDP wrong, you're also going to get productivity wrong. But that's the standard, whether it's experts at the Boston Federal Reserve or Forbes or elsewhere. But the person who invented GDP, the man who designed it, Simon Kuznets, he said, no, this is not a measure of welfare, that you cannot infer our welfare from the GDP. And this was the man who got the Nobel Prize for inventing it and was recognized by people like Paul Samuelson as creating one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. So if GDP is not a measure of welfare, what is it? It's a measure of production, not well-being. It's the production you produce, which may or may not reflect the value that you get from it. As we shift in an economy from one that's based more on atoms to one based more on bits, this traditional measure of production becomes less of a measure of value because bits have close to zero marginal cost. And we're getting to the point where we have more and more stuff being produced, but more of the value is coming from other sources. A great example is all of the digital goods that you can now get. Here are just some of the logos. I should have included a whole set of Chinese logos that would have a similar message, but all of you, of course, are participating in the digital economy in a great way and getting lots and lots of goods, almost all of which are available at zero cost. So how have these contributed to GDP? Well, if you go and look at the data and you go back to the 1980s, you see that the information section of the economy used to be only about 4.7% of GDP. Today, it's all the way up to 4.7% of GDP. So this underscores that despite this explosion of digitization, the GDP is completely missing it. We are not capturing it. These are the official data from the US government. It's almost identical when you look at other countries. The pattern holds over and over. How can this be that all these goods are not changing the GDP? Well, the reason is that when something has zero price, its contribution to GDP is zero. GDP is the value, the cost, the prices times the quantities. If the price is zero, then no matter how many Wikipedia pages you download, or how many YouTube videos, or how many courses on MIT OpenCourseWare that people learn from, they all get counted as zero value in the GDP statistics. So that's clearly a flaw of the system. So we have a different approach. We are not going to count the money that people spend on these goods. We're going to try to estimate consumer welfare, the value you get from them, more directly. And there are three basic techniques. They're all actually, you'll see, quite similar, but they involve you doing online choice experiments and lotteries. One is called single binary discrete choice experiments. One's a Becker-DeGroot-Marshak lottery. And the third method is these best-worst scaling. And don't worry, I'll explain a little bit more how they work. But the basic idea is we're going to do online choice experiments that have people compare how much they value one thing versus another thing. And from this, we can infer the ranking of all the different values and even compare them to things that you do have to pay for. And there are many things that are free that people value more than the things that they have to pay for. In some of the experiments, we do them with incentive compatibility and some without. What is incentive compatibility? That means that in some cases, if somebody says that they value a product A more than product B, we actually enforce that choice. And we say you get to keep product A, but you lose product B. So we enforce it. And that way, it gives them an incentive to be honest, because they will say what they really care about. If they said the wrong thing, they would lose the thing that they value more. So we are able to enforce that. We're able to do it with dollar values. If somebody says that I would be willing to give up Facebook if you gave me $10 per month, then we say, okay, we're going to take away Facebook from you, and we'll give you the money. And so if they weren't telling the truth, then they wouldn't get a good deal. And the fourth bullet point is perhaps the most interesting and important one. This is something new that we can do now, is we can do this at a massive scale. 20 or 30 years ago, we could do it with a few people in a laboratory. We could have some students come in, or we could interview some people. Now, with the digital platform, we can reach tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people, and run these experiments in essentially real time and gather an enormous amount of representative data for the economy. So that's the basic plan. And let me explain a little bit about what we found and how we did it. So to preview the findings, and then we'll explain how we got them, is that these choice experiments, when we do them, they look very plausible to me. I'll show them to you, and you can make your own judgments. But the valuations look very plausible. They're consistent depending on the different methods you use. And all of the methods give a very similar number. When you do it, in some cases, with incentive compatible, and in some cases without incentive compatible, the surprising thing to us was that people actually had higher values when we forced them to be incentive compatible. That is to say that the numbers that we do without incentive compatibility, when we just ask them, are probably lower bound estimates, and the real values are somewhat higher. That's interesting because in other research, for instance, looking at the value of pollution or so forth, or cleaning up pollution, I should say, it tended to be the other way around. But again, I'll show you the data on that as well. And to preview some other results, what we found was that people in our analyses had the greatest value for search, then email, maps, all the way down to messaging and music. All of these had significant value. All of them were available for free, but this is a preview of the ranking. I'll give you the exact values later. To give one particular one where we did a great deal more analysis of, we looked at Facebook in the United States, and we found that the median consumer, the person at the 50th percentile, was willing to pay about $450 to maintain access to Facebook. And I say median because that's 50th percentile. There were some people who were willing to pay much, much more, tremendously more, we found. Some people, of course, much, much less. Some people who had zero value for Facebook. But there's a whole range, there's a demand curve, and as you lower the price, more people would say, yes, I would want that. And as you raise the price, there are fewer people. The midpoint is about $450. Again, people in America pay $0 for Facebook, so this is a consumer surplus contribution that they don't currently account for in any of the national statistics. And as I hinted at before, although in this paper we've done it for a few goods, we can scale this up tremendously to lots of other goods and services. By the way, not just digital goods, you can use it for other traditional goods as well, and services. So let me give you a little economics lesson about how GDP and consumer welfare connect to each other using one of my favorite tools, which is a demand curve. And the way this works is, let's see if there's a pointer here. Let me step over here. So if you look here, there's a price, and at a higher price, and this is a demand curve here. So what this says is that at a high price, very few people, like 0 people, will buy it. The quantity is close to 0. But as the price gets lower, more people are willing to buy it. And the total area under the demand curve is the total value that people are willing to pay. A few people willing to pay a lot, some people a medium amount, some very little. If you add them all up, if you integrate under the demand curve, you get the total value from any good, any particular good. Could be from an automobile, a haircut, food, whatever good you decide to analyze. This blue rectangle is what people actually pay for the good. So they pay a price P, they get a quantity Q. P times Q is the total revenue. Price times quantity is the total revenue. And that's basically what GDP measures, is what people are paying for a certain number of goods. If you were to, and then this green triangle up here is the consumer surplus. That is the value that the people are getting above and beyond what they pay. So if they paid P dollars, let's say they paid $10, but their actual value was $30, then that person gets $20 of value. So if you're, and this person over here paid $10 and was only willing to pay up to $11, so they only get $1 of value. So some people get a lot of value, some people get less. The total is this triangle. So that's basic economics. Those of you who have had economics were probably very bored just now because you've heard this before. If you were to double the amount of cars in the economy, you would double this rectangle. You would also roughly double the value from them. So twice as many cars, maybe you get twice as much value. Twice as many haircuts, twice as much value. That's actually pretty good. In this case, GDP is a pretty good representative of value that you get from the good. So that's with so-called classic goods. The problem is when you get to digital goods. In this case, the price is 0. So when you double the quantity or increase it by any amount, you don't double, well, there's no increase in GDP. There's no additional revenue. But you are doubling the consumer surplus. So you can have more and more value from the digital goods and no change in GDP. And as more of the economy moves from bits to atoms, as more and more of it digitizes, then you're getting a bigger and bigger missing quantity, a bigger missing mass, a hidden part of the economy. So this is true for many, many goods, the ones I showed you. That's very bad, but the true story is even worse because there are many goods that are transitioning from traditional goods to digital goods. So for instance, encyclopedias. If you can get access to Wikipedia, you can get free information, and you don't need to pay for Encyclopedia Britannica. Or if you have use your smartphone for photography, you don't need to pay for all the digital, for all the chemical photos. In this case, the price step over here. The price, is this microphone working, by the way? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So the price is falling from P to 0. So what we have is the GDP is going down. There's less GDP captured in encyclopedias or digital photography or anything else that becomes digitized. But the value is going up. So we have them going in opposite directions. Lower GDP is actually correlated with more value. And our official measures are backwards. So once again, I want to really underscore, it's not just GDP, it's really our whole national accounts. Productivity has the wrong sign that it should have. So this is a really fundamental problem. Every day it's getting worse because every day more of the economy is becoming digital. If we were to become an entirely digital economy, I don't know if that will ever happen, but if we were, we would completely miss the whole measurement of our growth. So let me show you in a little more detail how this works for smartphones and cameras. In the year 2000, there were 80 billion photos taken worldwide. In 2015, there's 1.6 trillion. Yesterday, we were in Shenzhen. I think my girlfriend took about 1 billion more photos, roughly speaking. So it's constantly growing quite a bit. But the cost of the photos went from about 50 cents to 0 cents. So that's a good example of this problem I'm describing. The official price index, I looked at the people, the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the United States and in the OECD for the other countries. And their official price index looks at the price of film, developing, cameras, all the chemistry. But none of that is important anymore. It's all vanishing. And most photos, you don't buy and sell them really. They're just shared. You post them to social media. 0 cost. So GDP went down as the photography went up. And you may say, well, okay, but it's not captured in the photos themselves. What about the cameras? That's what people are paying for. But those are also disappearing. Not many people buy cameras anymore. And if you look at the official data, camera went up for a while, but now it's been falling for the past few years quite dramatically. Why is nobody? Well, I see people here taking pictures, which is fine. I'll make my slides available. But you're taking pictures with your phone, not with a standalone camera. Not many people run around with a standalone cameras. So this is not capturing anymore. Well, then you say, okay, isn't it captured in the phone? Don't we measure the GDP of the more additional phones being sold? Well, sadly, the answer there is also no, that we're not doing the quality adjustment. A phone in 2018 that might cost $800, you can buy for more, you can buy it for less, is really equivalent to both a traditional phone plus a camera put together, plus many other things. And in fact, here's a newspaper advertisement from the early 1990s, and all these things that you used to pay for, you now get included in the thing. It's not just the camera, the alarm clock, the calculator, computer, game machine, movie player. Down here, there's even something called an answering machine, if anybody knows what that is. So people used to buy these things. And many new things, GPS. GPS in the 1990s, I guess if you worked for the military, you could get one. You might have to pay $10,000 or $100,000. Now I have many GPS map systems on my phone. They're all free. Ebook read, all these things that you never could have had before. So this phone is just absorbing, sweeping up all these physical objects. What's happening to and then I should say, what's happening to the value? The official statistics say that these phones have had almost no quality adjustment. They don't count all these different components. If you go by the official data of the Bureau of Economic Analysis, there's been about a 10% improvement in the quality adjusted price of phones over the past 20 years. Roughly 0, I guess. So you can check your own government statistics, but by and large, we are not capturing all of this in any of the quality adjustments. So the point here is that it's not just free goods, it's also all these physical goods that are being absorbed by things like phones. And I could give you many more examples. So what we'll do is estimate the consumer's willingness to pay, that demand curve, including those for 0 price as well as those for positive price through these experiments. And that's how we're doing it. And this is what an experiment looks like. We go And in the laboratory, online, and elsewhere, we asked thousands and thousands of questions like this. Would you give up WeChat for a month, or would you rather give up Baidu search for a month? Let's do it right here. How many people, if you had to choose, you could only have one of them for the next month, either WeChat or Baidu. You can't have both of them. How many people would give up WeChat and keep Baidu? So option one, how many people, no more WeChat? Raise your hand. A few people, okay, about 10%. How many people, if you had to choose, it better be the rest of you, would give up Baidu search? So, okay, so this one, you guys value WeChat more than Baidu, but some people are on the other side. So there's some people in each group, and that's the reality, is that every person has a different set of valuations, and we can ask many, many choices like this, and we can see what the rankings are for different goods. We can also put values in there. We could put $10 or 100 won, and we could say, would you be willing to take the cash if you didn't have to use it? How many people here would be willing, let's call it, I don't know whether you want to use dollars or yen, what is it, about 60? 60 yuan? So how many people would choose option one? Give up WeChat, but I'll give you money. I'll give you $10 and you don't get to use it. How many people would choose that? I didn't pick a high number. How about if I made it 10 times as much? What if I made it $100? How many people, if I gave you $100, would use no WeChat for 1 month? Okay, not very many. All right, $1,000. If I gave you $1,000, how many people would? Okay, now we get a little more. So the value, you can see, for some people the value is 10, for some of it is 100. Many people it's less than 1,000. And there's some values in between. What I just did is exactly what we're going to do on a massive scale. We're going to ask many, many experiments, and we're going to get a demand curve. We will see what the values are for these goods. These experiments have been widely used in many areas, marketing and so forth. I won't go into detail, but this is something that our marketing friends have been doing for a while, but not at this massive scale. And we're going to do it in 3 different ways. In a laboratory with about 500 people. We're doing it with a survey, a large online survey with about 5,000. And then the really exciting one is we use a platform called Google Consumer Surveys, where we can reach 200,000 people. Actually, now it's over 1 million people for these short surveys, very, very cheaply, very, very efficiently. And each of them, we ask this choice over and over. So the first category is these, what we call single binary discrete choice experiments. And we just have a binary choice, either this or that, either the WeChat or the Baidu, either the good or the money. Which one would you is more important to you? And by changing the value, we can get a whole demand curve, like I did just now, $10, $50, $100, $1,000. And we also do some of them incentive compatible. This is hard to do at large scale, but we're able to do it with our laboratory and with our online ones. And the way we do this is that we say, we will give you the money, but only after 1 month if we can test and make sure you have not used Facebook for 1 month. And I don't know how many people here use Facebook. Is Facebook? Yes, so some people use it here. So if you look, you can actually see whether your friend has been on Facebook in the past 24 hours or last week or a month ago. So we use that feature to say, if you stay away from Facebook for 30 days, we will pay you. But if you use Facebook, you get no money. What dollar amount do we have to pay you to be willing to do that? And this is incentive compatible. That way we can make sure they only get the money if they really don't use Facebook. They can't say, oh, I won't use it. We can test whether they really did. And here's what we found. Here's the first dollar results I'll show you. So we looked at it for about 1,500 people, 1,497 people. And these black dots here are how much people had to be paid. So for $50, we see that about 50% of the people, these dots here actually was $37. So the median was a little bit less than $50. But there are some people who you'd have to pay over $500. There's some people, even if you gave them $1, they would quickly give it up. So a whole range. And this is a kind of a downward sloping demand curve. As you can see, the lower the price, the more people who keep Facebook. the higher the price, the more people who are willing to give up Facebook. We also know something about the people. We have demographic data, and we found that the people who spend more time on Facebook, not surprisingly, had higher values. So we also see that if you have more friends, you're more likely to demand a higher value. People who post more, people who watch more videos, they all have higher values. Women, on average, those of you who are female in here, on average, were willing to pay more for Facebook. Older people, I was a little bit surprised about older people, and then some of my younger friends told me that's because there are much better social networks than Facebook that old people don't know about. So if you go to Snapchat or whatever, so the younger people had substitution, they had options, and so they were willing to give up Facebook. Older people, that's all we knew about. So these all give you some of the ways that you can do it, and to me it seems sort of plausible. I was a little surprised how high the value is, but that's what the data is. People were not willing to give up Facebook unless we gave them an average of about $30, $37 per month. I should say there's a range here. We only did it for a relatively small group, so you can have an error bound, so we can do statistical analyses as to 95% confidence level. It's more than 27 or less than 51. The great thing about statistics is as you do bigger and bigger samples, you can make that error tighter and tighter. So if we did 4 times as many samples, we'd have half as much of an error bound. If we had 10 or 100 times more data, we would get it even smaller. And here's the one with incentive compatibility relaxed. The white dots are when we enforced it. We said, we're really going to take away Facebook from you. The black dots was just, we said, promise us, you tell us the true value. So they're similar, but on average, when we really enforced it, people demanded a higher value. So that tells you something about the importance of incentive compatible. And also, I should say, some potential biases. If you don't control for incentive compatibility, you may get a biased estimate. You may get a lower estimate than the truth. Another approach is so-called BDM lotteries, or Becker-DeGroot-Marshak lotteries, that was developed first back in 1964. In this case, we just ask them what value they would need, and we tell them we're going to randomly pick a number, and if the value they said is higher than that, we'll pay them. If the value they said is lower than that, we don't pay them, and they keep the product. And the only point I want to make here is that the curves are very, very similar. We get almost the same shape of curve as we did before, and so the effects are not very different. And then we scaled it up to using Google consumer surveys, and if you browse the web, at least in the United States, you will occasionally see these surveys pop up where people ask you questions. Different marketing people may ask you, do you like this car company rental or this car company rental? Do you like this brand or that brand? And they're just doing surveys, market research. We decided to use that platform, and we asked them questions like this one, would you give up Facebook for $5? And then we did many, many surveys of that, hundreds of thousands of different variants with different prices, different products, and we got different estimates here. Here's the ones for Wikipedia. Similar to the Facebook one, different values. You get a downward sloping curve. Here it is for many other things, email, search, maps, video. In each case, you get a downward sloping curve. That means that higher prices, more people will give it up, and lower prices, more people will keep it. I should note that in each case, we use a logarithmic scale there, 10, 50, so it's powers of 10, orders of magnitude increasing. So these are actually log linear charts, roughly, but they're not exactly. Each one has a slightly different shape. E-commerce, social media, messaging, music. As you can see, they all have different valuations, and they all, to me, look sort of roughly plausible. If you want to see the dollars associated, here is the median value. Search engines had the highest value. Most people, 50% of people would need to be paid $14,000 in America to go without search engines. So they really like their search engines. Email, they'd have to be paid $6,000 to go away without it for a whole year. Music, only $140. So they get different values. And in each of these, you need to be a little bit careful how you interpret it. This was music online, so people could get music in other ways. maybe listen to the radio, or they have CDs or other players. But it gives you a sense, all these are free goods, but people actually have quite a high value for it. And in 2017, the values changed a little bit. It looks like they went up a little bit on average, although I don't want to overinterpret it because we have error noise around that. You can do it for non-digital good too. So my focus, as I said in the beginning, was this fact that the digital economy is not measured in GDP statistics. Physical goods, like breakfast cereal, are measured. I picked breakfast cereal partly because there were some famous economists who studied breakfast cereal in the 90s, believe it or not, like Jerry Hausman, to understand what the demand was for them. So we thought we would use our methods to be comparable. And what you see is that breakfast cereal in America, people were willing to pay $48. I should actually say willingness to accept, to be more precise. They would only give up breakfast cereal for a year if we paid them $48. Otherwise, they would say, no, I'd rather keep my breakfast cereal. You can have other kinds of breakfast, to be clear. This is just cereal. If you look at the total US economy, that works out to be about $15 billion of consumer surplus. The data show that the actual spending on consumers by consumers on cereal was about $10 billion. So according to our analyses, people get about $1.50 of value for every dollar they spend on breakfast cereal in this particular case. And you could do this for any good. We just picked that particular one. So it shows that it works for all types of goods. And for things like smartphones, we also did some experiments. As I mentioned earlier, the consumer price index only improved by less than 10% over 20 years for phones. We did an incentive-compatible study where we asked students in Belgium whether or not they were willing to have no more camera on their phone for 1 month, 30 days. And we will pay them if they agreed not to do that. And to enforce it so they couldn't cheat, we didn't take their phone away from them. We said, you can keep your phone, but we put this special tape on it, this red tape, and it's kind of sticky and you can't peel it off. If you peel it off, it looks like this, and we can see that they cheated. So 1 month later, they have to come back, and if the seal is unbroken, they get the money, but if the seal is broken, they don't get any cash. So we did the survey and we saw what we would have to pay to get them to be willing to give up a camera. I was amazed at how much people needed to be. People really love their cameras. At least these are students, so maybe they're a little bit biased. But the average value was about 68 euros. That's about euros about equal to $1, a little bit more. So for 1 month, we had to pay them 68 euros in order to get them to give up the camera. Tremendous amount of value. The manufacturing is only about $20 to $30, so there's a huge, huge surplus created by all those photos that people are taking, none of which shows up in the GDP statistics. You can also do this best worst scaling. Let me just jump ahead here because I want to leave some time for our discussion and so forth. You can do it for digital goods. You can do it for physical goods. I mentioned breakfast cereal, but you could ask about televisions, toilets in the home, airline travel, public transport. The reason I included toilets is that my good friend Bob Gordon wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And he emphasized how valuable indoor plumbing was, what a great invention that was. I've debated him a number of times at TED and other stages. And whenever I talk about all the digital goods, he said, oh, but nothing is as important as a toilet. So I said, okay, I'm not going to disagree with you on that. That's very important. But he likes to hold that up as the great invention of the past being more important than the great inventions of our era. So I thought I would include it and see. So we did a survey and we asked where they all came. We also put dollar values in there and tried those. So let me show you the results there and put them all in one chart here. And Bob Gordon was right. The most valuable one, toilets in the home. So in a way, I'm kind of glad. But actually, I was surprised how close. Internet was very, very close. I think I'll ask this audience just for kicks. If you had to choose between toilets and internet, you had to give up one of them for, let's say, just say 1 month. How many people would give up toilets? No, you can still go to the public restroom, but toilets, no. How many people would give up toilets and keep internet? Few people. Younger people. How many people would give up internet and keep their toilets? Okay. So you guys are more like Bob Gordon. But this is the kind of thing, and you know, money, I guess in the United States, people would pay over $10,000 to keep that, or have to accept over $10,000. And you see all the other ones there. Televisions, meeting friends. Some people were willing to not meet their friends anymore for a year. No more smartphone, no more online shopping. Facebook is there, breakfast cereal down near the bottom. Actually, I was a little bit surprised. Where's Jets, airline travel? There it is, airline travel. This one really surprised me. I'm always flying around, but the average American values it at less than $10. I was amazed. I guess they don't fly that much. But this is, actually I shouldn't say the average American, this is the median American, 50th percentile. So a lot of people, they don't fly, you know, and so they don't need that. But you get the whole ranking there. And now I like putting them on this chart because you can compare digital goods versus non-digital goods. You can compare dollars versus actual goods. And you start getting a ranking of where the value is in the economy like we've never seen before. This is completely different than what the GDP statistics would show you or the productivity statistics. But I think this is really more what the people are valuing. It's what they say they're valuing. So a couple more points here. You can actually do a mapping from welfare into GDP, even though they're designed for separate purposes. If you do some clever algebra, you can infer one from the other. The problem is that you have to measure quality adjustments, you have to measure the free goods, and so forth. If you do those measurements and you add them into GDP, you can get some valuation from it. So two of the world's experts in GDP calculations and measurement are Erwin Dewart and Kevin Fox. So we added them to our team, and we're writing a new paper now that should come out in another couple of weeks that does this mapping between GDP and welfare calculations. And this will allow us to understand better where the weaknesses are and where the strengths are. I'll show you a little bit of the algebra here. The first thing you need to do is adjust GDP for new goods. When a new good is invented, it creates a lot of value, but the GDP statistics don't capture that. So the creation, the invention of new goods is one of the biggest sources of unmeasured benefit in the GDP statistics. I should say I wasn't the first person to discover this. Many people have identified this problem, and there have been commissions. Bob Gordon was on one, Marty Feldstein, saying that the GDP statistics are missing the value of new goods, and perhaps 1 to 2% of additional value every year in the United States is created by new goods that is not in the GDP statistics. But that's not the only weakness. There's also this weakness I pointed out about free goods. And if you had a way of measuring the value people are willing to pay for the free goods like we do, you can make an adjustment. You can't do it with the price system. You have to do what we did. Otherwise, you can never get it. And that's still not enough. You also have to look at not just new free goods, but free goods that have been around for a while that improve. So Wikipedia keeps adding more and more articles over time. Facebook has new features. YouTube has more videos. And likewise, Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, they all add features over time, and you have to account for all of those improvements as well. And the algebra for it is a little complicated. You know, I can refer you to the paper, but the good news is that if you measure these things, you actually can get a connection. No one has ever measured it before because these numbers, these W's, these willingness to pays, and the quantities, no one has ever set out a project to try to measure them. And so now we are measuring them. Once we get all the numbers, we'll put them in. I should say, one of the nice thing about them is we have the numbers. The bad thing is that we can't get nearly the same precision as GDP. You know, GDP is measured to 9 significant digits. They're very, very precise. I showed you the error of the things. Sometimes it's plus or minus 10 or 20%. If we have larger samples, we can get it down to plus or minus 1 or 2%. But I don't think we will ever get the same level of precision as the GDP. But as I told my students and I tell my critics, I think it's better to be approximately correct than precisely wrong. So I think we are at least getting in the right direction with these numbers going forward. So I see I'm about out of time here, so let me just wrap up with a conclusion and say that I'm a big fan of GDP. It's an amazing invention. Paul Samuelson called it one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. You usually don't think of a measurement framework as an invention, but I guess it is an invention. And it's the way that all the journalists, most of the economists, government officials measure our economy. But it's wrong. It's actually not a measure of well-being. It's a measure of production, and I should say, it's too harsh to say it's wrong. It's a measure of something different than what most people think it's a measure of. It's a good measure of production. If you're a central banker, you want to know what the money's being spent on things is, use GDP. But if you want to know whether the people are better off or worse off, you have to use something like what we've been using, some other kind of metric, like consumer surplus. These massive online surveys point a way of solving this. I think they're a much better supplement to measuring things. They have a whole set of benefits. They are good for digital goods. They can be used for ordinary goods like breakfast cereal or toilets or jet travel. They can be scaled up. And one other thing I should mention, they can be run in almost real time. So while the GDP numbers come out once per quarter, we do these surveys and we get a turnaround time in less than a week or even a couple of days. We post the survey, we get the data back very, very quickly. Sometimes I work with Avi Gananameni, my student co-author on this, and I'll tell him, I think we should redo this one. Can you run the experiment? And then we meet 2 days later, and he's got the data back for me. So this is a wonderful thing about the digital economy. Those of you who are digital entrepreneurs, you can do these A/B tests very quickly to get data. And ultimately, as I showed you at the end there, this approach can be incorporated into the national accounts. It's not either or, it's a synergy between the two, and we can map between them, and we can understand how changes in GDP, if you make these adjustments, will also reflect welfare improvements. So I have a bunch of papers that are coming out. There's a working paper that we finished just at the end of last year. We have 2 papers that are coming out soon, one of them in the American Economic Review in May, Papers and Proceedings, and others that we're going to be submitting. There's one I'm working on with Danny Kahneman on the nature of the biases that may be in these, and I'm very excited about this program. Do I have my, and if you want to read more about it, I have an online website, digital.mit.edu. I thought I put it on the slide, but you go to digital.mit.edu/Erik, then you can get access to these papers and any of the other research we've been doing. So ultimately, I think we can overcome this paradox of the digital age, that we can measure things more precisely than we ever have before, with more accuracy, and get the answers to the real question, which is how are we doing? Are we doing better or worse? And this is one of the promises of the digital economy, to understand the nature of our well-being. Well, thanks very much for giving me a chance to share some of these findings.